Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the necrophiliac couple of 1910 and their macabre pact, sealed by letters found in Kansas, that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from that helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. History, as we conceive of it, is a curated narrative, a grand tapestry woven from the threads of celebrated triumphs and documented tragedies. But the true fabric of the past is far more complex, and its darkest patterns are often hidden away, left to fester in forgotten corners. They lie dormant in the brittle pages of a sealed diary, buried under the bureaucratic dust of civic indifference. Waiting. Our story begins in one such corner, in the unnaturally quiet, climate-controlled basement of the Donovan County Historical Society in the year 1963. It begins not with the thunder of revelation, but with the whisper of aging paper. An archivist, a meticulous man, whose life was a patient pilgrimage through the mundane records of harvests, land deeds, and town council meetings, came upon a water-damaged cardboard box. It was heavy, anonymous amongst its peers, and the faded blue ink on its lid bore the deceptively simple word correspondence. The years it referenced, 1910 to 1915, were of mild academic interest, a period of quiet agricultural growth, but nothing suggested its contents were in any way extraordinary. With the practiced, careful hands of a seasoned historian, he lifted the lid, releasing the faint, cloying scent of time, paper, and something indefinably melancholic. What he was about to uncover would unravel a narrative so profoundly disturbing, so fundamentally alien to the placid history of Kansas, that it would poison the county's memory for generations to come. He began to read, his glasses perched on the end of his nose. The first few pages were penned in an elegant, educated script, indicative of a thoughtful mind. But as he delved deeper, the scholarly focus in his eyes, the dispassionate lens through which he viewed the past, began to curdle. A subtle tremor started in his hand. The words on the page spoke of love, a profound connection, of a shared philosophy. But this was not a love that celebrated life, companionship, or the warmth of shared dreams. This was a love affair with stillness, a devotion to the final, perfect moment of cessation. The letters were not a record of life, but a meticulously detailed testament to its violation. He read phrases that made no logical sense in a love letter, the sublime artistry of the specimen. Our shared appreciation for what others fear to acknowledge. The preservation of delicate tissues. A cold sweat beaded on his forehead. A chill that had nothing to do with the basement's regulated temperature. He felt a sudden, visceral need for fresh air, pushing his chair back with a jarring scrape that echoed in the tomb-like silence. This was not history. This was an artifact of pure pathology. After reading for less than an hour, the archivist carefully, almost reverently, placed the letter back into its yellowed envelope. His hands, usually so steady, now fumbled with the string tie of the box. He picked up the telephone, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt a civic and moral duty that violently eclipsed all academic protocol. The authorities, the sheriff, someone they needed to know what evil had once walked their quiet county roads. What followed was not the public outcry one might expect. Not a sensational news story that ripped through the fabric of the small Kansas community. Instead, what followed was a swift, surgical, and deeply unsettling silence. A brief, hushed investigation was opened, conducted by men whose grim faces betrayed the horror of what they were reading. And then, just as quickly, it was closed. The box and its horrifying contents were sealed once more, not returned to the general archive, but relegated to a locked vault, an official secret. The consensus among the few who knew was clear. Unspoken, yet absolute, some truths are too monstrous to be disinterred. Some stories are a contagion, better left to rot in the darkness from which they came. To understand the leaden silence of 1963, one must travel back through the corridors of time, more than half a century. To the very source of that rot, we must go to the town of Elwood, Kansas. As it existed in the year 1910, Elwood was a town held in the sleepy, humid embrace of the Missouri River, a place that felt less like a community and more like a collection of solitary existences, loosely bound by geography and a shared, unspoken agreement to mind one's own affairs. It was a town defined more by what it lacked than by what it possessed. It lacked the noise, the grime, the raw ambition of St. Joseph, its bustling industrial neighbor across the water. It lacked significant commerce, its rhythms dictated by the slow, predictable cycle of planting and harvesting across the vast, sun-scorched farmlands that stretched into an endless, hazy horizon. The silence here was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered sound. It was broken only by the rhythmic chirping of cicadas in the oppressive summer heat, the distant, mournful horn of a Union Pacific train cutting through the plains, or the Sunday morning peal of the Methodist church bell. It was a place where privacy was a paradox. Everyone knew their neighbors' comings and goings, yet a deep-seated stoicism prevented them from ever truly asking why. This culture of reserved non-interference allowed secrets to fester undisturbed, like stagnant water beneath the placid surface of a pond. The Missouri River itself, a muddy, indifferent god, served as both a lifeline and a veil. It brought barges of goods and the occasional new face, but it also functioned as a psychological barrier, separating Elwood from the wider world, wrapping it in a bubble of perceived tranquility and moral certainty. This was an era of profound transition for America, a time of invention and progress. But in Elwood, time seemed to have coagulated. It was the perfect stage, an isolated laboratory for a quiet horror to take root and bloom. In an age when forensic science was in its infancy, when a county coroner's conclusion could be swayed by local politics or a simple desire to avoid trouble, and when rumor traveled faster and held more weight than fact. A carefully constructed facade of normalcy was the only armor one needed to conceal the most unthinkable of sins. And into this stagnant tableau, in the temperate spring of 1908, walked a man who was the very embodiment of that facade. Theodore Blackwood did not arrive with a storm, but with the quiet, deliberate purpose of a shadow detaching itself from a wall. He purchased a modest two-story house on the town's rural fringe, a property set back from the main road and buffered by a grove of cottonwood trees. Crucially, it included a small, detached workshop. His arrival was noted, as all new arrivals were, with a flicker of curiosity that quickly faded, according to county records. His occupation was listed as a medical supplier, a term both respectably vague and professionally authoritative, which discouraged further questions. To his neighbors, Mr. Blackwood was a model of civility and restraint. He was polite but impenetrable, offering a tipped hat or a reserved nod in greeting. He conducted his business at the general store with a quiet, unnerving efficiency. His shopping list always precise, his conversation minimal, but beneath the placid surface, there were dissonant notes in his quiet symphony of normalcy. His eyes, though intelligent, remained vacant and observational. like those of a naturalist studying a peculiar insect. They registered information but betrayed no hint of emotion, no spark of connection. And then there was the workshop. It became a source of quiet, fearful speculation. He immediately set about reinforcing it, adding a new deadbolt to the thick oak door and fitting heavy blackout curtains to its windows. Deliveries arrived for it monthly, always after dark, unloaded from an unmarked wagon that rumbled over the bridge from St. Joseph. James Henderson, the 17-year-old son of the neighboring farmer, once hid in a ditch and watched as two men grunted under the weight of a long, heavy wooden crate, its shape disturbingly reminiscent of a plain pine coffin. The next day, a strange, chemical scent, like vinegar and sweet flowers, lingered in the air. For a year and a half, Theodore's strange, solitary routine became just another piece of Elwood's local folklore, a curiosity to be whispered about but never challenged. Then, in the harsh, biting winter of 1909, another outsider arrived, stepping off the train into a world of white, frozen silence, if Theodore was a shadow. Eleanor Wright was a flicker of intense, cold light. She took a room at Mrs. Henley's boarding house on Elm Street, registering as a widow from Springfield, Illinois, seeking a fresh start from a past shrouded in grief. She was described by those who met her as a handsome, strikingly intelligent woman of about 30, but what people remembered most was as Mrs. Henley would later write in her diary, a peculiar intensity in her eyes, as if she were looking right through a person to the bones beneath. Eleanor's explanations of her past were fluid, a masterpiece of subtle invention that changed with her audience. To the gentle Mrs. Henley, her late husband was a tender professor of natural sciences, tragically consumed by a wasting illness. To her new employer, Dr. Morrison, he was a brilliant research physician, a man of science to the very end. To the minister's wife, he had been a heroic military surgeon who had seen the horrors of the Spanish-American War. No record of an Edward Wright matching any of these descriptions could ever be found. She found work as an assistant doctor, Morrison's medical practice, and it quickly became apparent that her skills were extraordinary. Her lack of formal training was immediately overshadowed by a profound, almost instinctual knowledge of anatomy, surgical procedures, and, most unnervingly, chemical preservatives. But it was her behavior around the dying that truly set her apart from any woman the town had ever known. She was not merely comforting, she was fascinated. Dr. Morrison's own records, preserved in the dusty county medical archives, note that Mrs. Wright shows an unusual fascination with terminal cases and has requested to be present during final moments on multiple occasions. She speaks of the physical processes of dying with a clinical detachment one would expect from a seasoned pathologist. She was drawn to the precipice between life and death with a chilling passion most people reserved for art, for faith, for life itself. Elwood, Kansas, a town of barely 1,000 souls, now unknowingly housed two of a kind. They had not yet met. They moved in their separate, solitary orbits on the edge of the small community. Two magnets of opposing poles, unaware of the powerful, inevitable pull that was drawing them closer. In the oppressive quiet of the riverside town, two frequencies of a singular, terrible obsession were beginning to resonate, waiting only for the moment they would finally connect and amplify into a symphony of darkness. The catalyst arrived on the 12th of January, 1910. It was a day of biting winds and a sky the color of hammered lead, a day that seemed to drain the very world of warmth and vitality. Theodore Blackwood walked into Dr. Morrison's office, his face a mask of placid discomfort as he complained of persistent headaches, a common ailment. A perfect pretense. Dr. Morrison, a man of simple diagnoses and sincere, if limited, compassion, saw nothing at all amiss. He listened patiently, his mind already cycling through tinctures and tonics. But as he turned to his cabinet for a bottle of laudanum, it happened, for the first time. Theodore Blackwood and Eleanor Wright were in the same small enclosed space, breathing the same air thick with the scent of carbolic acid and winter damp. It was not a spark of romance, not a moment of flirtatious recognition that passed between them. It was something far deeper, more primal, and infinitely more unsettling. As Eleanor handed Theodore a glass of water, their eyes met. The moment distended, stretching into a profound, silent eternity in that shared gaze. Beneath the oblivious hum of Dr. Morrison's examination, they saw each other, not as the world saw them, the reserved supplier, the grieving widow, but as they truly were. It was a silent, mutual acknowledgement of a shared, secret geography of the soul, a landscape of profound isolation and morbid curiosity that no one else had ever glimpsed, let alone understood. Dr. Morrison saw only a polite, clinical exchange. But in that fraction of a second, Theodore and Eleanor had conducted an entire conversation, a confession, and a solemn invitation. Theodore returned to the office 3 more times that month, each time with a new, plausible complaint. Each time, he ensured Eleanor was working. Their conversations were never more than brief, formal pleasantries. Yet the unspoken current between them grew stronger. A high-tension wire humming with a dangerous and exhilarating energy. By early February, they had been seen walking together after Sunday church services, their heads bowed close against the winter wind, speaking in hushed tones that immediately fell silent the moment anyone approached. The townsfolk of Elwood saw a tentative, perhaps even fitting, courtship between 2 lonely souls. What they were actually witnessing was the forging of a terrible and perfect alliance. The true communion, however, did not happen in the open air of Elwood's dusty streets. It began in the sanctum of the written word, in his locked and silent house. Theodore Blackwood sat down at his heavy oak writing desk. He did not use common stationery, but a thick, cream-colored paper, the kind reserved for important legal documents or final testaments. With a steady, almost reverent hand, he dipped his fountain pen into a pot of black ink and began to write. The letter was a masterpiece of veiled confession, a coded overture to a kindred spirit. He wrote of the profound recognition he felt upon their meeting, of his lifelong search for another soul who understood the beauty of stillness, the perfection of the final moment. He referenced her late husband's passing, not with the empty platitudes of sympathy, but with a chilling admiration for her proximity to that sacred threshold. It was a letter that, to any other reader, would have seemed like the poetic, if eccentric, ramblings of a morbid intellectual. To Eleanor, it was a key turning in a lock she had thought rusted shut forever. She received it not by post, but found it tucked discreetly into the frame of her boarding house door, a pale spectre in the evening gloom. Left sometime in the dead of night, she read it in the absolute privacy of her small room, the paper trembling almost imperceptibly in her hands. A wave of emotions, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, washed over her for her entire life. She had harbored thoughts she believed to be uniquely monstrous, a private world of fascination she had to conceal behind a carefully constructed mask of normalcy. Now, here, in this elegant script, was proof she was not alone. Her response, penned that very night, was equally guarded yet resonant with a shared, forbidden understanding. To speak openly of matters I have kept hidden for so long is both terrifying and exhilarating, she wrote. There is a recognition that passes between those who have glimpsed beyond the veil. I too have sensed our kinship from our first meeting. Thus began a correspondence that would become the central pillar of their shared reality, a written world where the unspeakable was not only spoken but celebrated. They became prolific writers, exchanging letters several times a week, sometimes daily. This practice, as revealed in the documents later discovered, was not born of convenience but of sacred ritual. They rarely used the official mail. Instead, they would hand deliver their missives, leaving them in the hollowed out stump of a lightning scarred oak or beneath a loose stone on the path between their properties. This act transformed the mundane landscape of Elwood into a secret geography of their own making. It was not a game. It was a form of intellectual foreplay, a way of creating physical artifacts of their dark communion, of building an almost unbearable anticipation for their in-person encounters, where the theories discussed on paper would be put into practice. The letters were their true scripture, the chronicle of their glorious descent. As the winter of 1910 thawed into a damp, grey spring, the content of their letters evolved. The initial, philosophical explorations of death and beauty gave way to a more practical and far more sinister dialogue. They developed a private, chilling lexicon to describe their shared obsession, a coded language that sanitized the grotesque and elevated it to the level of high art or esoteric science. Human remains were never referred to as such. They were specimens, acquisitions, or, in moments of particular fondness, honored guests. Their work of preservation was artistry, a process of transcendence. Their late-night excursions to local cemeteries were not grave robbing. They were expeditions to commune with the peaceful residents. This linguistic framework was essential. It was a psychological fortress they built around themselves, a shared delusion that allowed them to see their actions not as desecration, but as a form of salvation, a noble calling to rescue fleeting beauty from the profound indignity of decay. Eleanor, with a privileged position inside the trusted walls of Dr. Morrison's practice, became the partnership's chief observer, its intelligence officer. Her fascination with terminal cases now had a chilling and definitive purpose. In a small leather-bound notebook she kept hidden in the pocket of her apron, she began to methodically document the physical progression of various diseases. She was no longer just an assistant. She was a researcher of decay. She would sit with the dying, her face a perfect mask of compassion, her hand gently holding theirs, while her sharp clinical eyes recorded every minute detail, the subtle shift in skin pallor from waxen to ashen, the changing depth and rhythm of respiration, the unique, faintly sweet scent of impending mortality. The elderly gentleman with the consumption. She wrote to Theodore in a letter dated April 17th. Exhibits a fascinating hollowing of the cheeks. His bone structure is becoming truly exceptional. I believe the preservation of such a form would present a worthy artistic challenge. Dr. Morrison, in his profound naivety, saw only a deeply empathetic caregiver, a woman whose own past grief had given her a unique and selfless gift for end-of-life care. He never once suspected that her comfort was merely the detached curiosity of a collector assessing the quality of a potential acquisition. Their expeditions to the local cemetery also became more frequent, more purposeful. Under the cold, silver light of a full moon, they would wander among the tombstones, their dark figures moving like wraiths through the sleeping town. Their purpose was not vandalism or theft, but connoisseurship. They would study the most recent graves, critically assessing the crude handiwork of the local undertaker. The closure of the mouth on the miller boy is imprecise, Theodore noted in a letter describing one such visit. It creates an expression of surprise rather than repose. A simple thread passed through the septum, and a more delicate touch with the setting compound would have yielded a far superior result. They were scholars in a graveyard, artists in exile, seeking to perfect a craft that society had deemed profane. These midnight walks were more than reconnaissance. They were a reinforcement of their shared worldview, a solemn confirmation that they alone understood the true potential that lay sleeping and tragically wasted beneath the Kansas soil. The pressure to act on this knowledge, to move from mere theory to applied practice, was building between them like a static charge before a lightning strike. The moment of ultimate initiation, the transition from a partnership of the mind to one of hands and deeds, arrived on a moonless night in late spring. The anticipation, built over weeks of fevered correspondence, was a palpable thing, a third presence between them. Theodore had finally deemed Eleanor ready to witness his life's work. He met her on the path near a small cabin and led her in silence toward his property. The workshop, which stood as a dark, silent monolith against the star-dusted sky, seemed to hum with a secret, contained energy. The air around it was thick with the faint, sweet and sour scent of chemicals she now recognized not as strange, but as familiar as the very perfume of her calling. Theodore did not use his key immediately. He paused at the heavy, reinforced door, turning to look at her in the gloom. His face was unreadable, a mask of shadows, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. This was the final threshold, the last door to the truth of him and of herself. He unlocked the deadbolt. The sound was a loud, definitive, metallic clank that seemed to tear through the oppressive silence and push the door open into a void of absolute, ink-black darkness. He led her inside, pulling the heavy door shut and locking it behind them. For a long moment, they stood in the suffocating dark, the only sound their own quiet, controlled breathing. Then came the sharp scratch of a match, and a small brave flame bloomed in Theodore's cupped hand. He lit a single oil lamp on a central table, its warm, flickering glow pushing back the shadows, but only partially, revealing the spares in slow, deliberate pieces. The room was not what she had somehow expected. It was not a gruesome charnel house or a chaotic butcher's shop. It was a space of meticulous, almost fanatical order. He did not speak. He let the scene reveal itself. A master showman unveiling his masterpiece. As her eyes adjusted, she saw that the workshop was arranged like a private museum, a bizarre and holy sanctuary. Along one wall stood a series of tall, glass-fronted cabinets. Inside, illuminated by the lamp's soft, forgiving glow, were dozens of glass jars containing smaller specimens, arranged by type hearts, lungs, hands, each perfectly preserved, floating in clear or amber-colored liquid like impossible biological sculptures. But it was the center of the room that commanded her attention. On 3 raised platforms stood larger arrangements, each draped in a heavy, dark velvet cloth, with a slow, theatrical movement. Theodore moved to the first, and with a single, fluid motion, he pulled away the covering. Eleanor's sharp intake of breath was not of horror, nor of disgust. It was a gasp of profound, unadulterated awe. Before her sat 2 figures, an elderly man and woman, positioned at a small wooden table. They were fully dressed in their Sunday best. The man held a checkerboard on his lap, his preserved hand hovering over a piece, his face a mask of thoughtful concentration. The woman looked on, a gentle, knowing smile gracing her perfectly preserved features. They were frozen in a moment of quiet, eternal domestic contentment. "I call this the last game," Theodore said, his voice a low, proud whisper that caressed the silence. He moved to the next platform, unveiling a young woman in a rocking chair, a book of poetry open on her lap, her expression serene, her eyes, made of luminous glass, seeming to gaze at some distant, beautiful thought he had personally bestowed upon her. This was his gallery, his life's work, a collection of human beings he had rescued from the oblivion of decay and elevated to a state of permanent, tranquil perfection. As they walked through the silent, watching figures, the final, brittle walls of their individual isolation crumbled into dust. Here, in this secret room, they were not monsters, they were gods, curators of eternity. Theodore, seeing the rapturous, almost religious understanding in Eleanor's eyes, finally confessed his own genesis. He spoke of his time as an assistant at a funeral home in St. Louis, of the first furtive snip of a lock of hair, the irresistible thrill of taking a small, secret token. He described how that impulse grew, from a finger to a hand, until he felt compelled to perfect the entire form. An artistic obsession that led to his employer's suspicions and his necessary flight to the anonymity of Elwood. And in that moment, surrounded by the silent congregation of the dead, Eleanor gave him her own confession, the true story of her late husband. Edward, he had not been her husband at all, but a lonely, tubercular patient she had nursed in Illinois, a man of remarkable physical beauty. When he died, she could not bear the thought of that beauty being consumed by the earth. In a desperate, amateurish frenzy, she had kept his body in her small house for 17 days, washing him with alcohol, trying with her limited knowledge and frantic passion to halt the inevitable, until the encroaching stench of decay and the pointed questions of a landlord forced her to abandon her first, failed masterpiece. Her flight to Kansas was not one of grief, but of shame at her own artistic inadequacy. The sharing of these origin stories, their deepest and most formative sins, was a sacrament. It was a bond forged in a shared pathology that they now, in this gallery, redefined as a shared artistic vision. They were no longer two separate, obsessive individuals. They were a single entity. Their purpose clarified, their resolve hardened into something diamond-like and unbreakable. The euphoria of this final consummation filled the room, a silent, powerful energy that seemed to animate the still figures around them. Their gazes met over the serene face of the woman in the rocking chair, and their vision, once focused on the past and the already dead, now turned decisively toward the future. It was Eleanor who broke the reverent silence, her voice barely a whisper, yet sharp with a new, predatory clarity. "The elderly gentleman at the practice," she began. "Mr. Garvey, the one with the consumption." Theodore turned his full attention to her, his eyes glowing with a terrifying lucidity in the lamplight. "His bone structure is exceptional," she continued. She delivered the line with the cool detachment of a sculptor assessing a block of fine, unblemished marble. "And the disease has created a haunting gauntness that would preserve beautifully." She paused, letting the implication hang in the chemical-scented air like a spore. "He would make an excellent addition to our gallery." Theodore did not recoil. He did not question. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture of absolute, unholy agreement. In that single nod, a terrible line was crossed. They had evolved. They were no longer just collectors of the dead. They were now poised to become its creators. The pact made in the lamplit gallery, the chilling agreement to procure a fresh specimen, marked a fundamental transformation. Theodore and Eleanor had crossed a Rubicon of the soul, graduating from passive curators to active, godlike collectors. Their correspondence from the spring of 1910 reflects this newfound, terrible purpose with an almost religious seal. A letter from Theodore, dated April 29th, speaks in euphoric, triumphant tones of their first collaborative success. Last night's expedition was beyond anything I could have hoped for, he wrote. Our newest guest arrived from Atchison, a specimen of such unparalleled grace and form that I find myself breathless in her presence. The artistry required to do her justice will be the greatest challenge of my career. You, my dearest Eleanor, have brought me a masterpiece. The name of that masterpiece, a name that would not be linked to the Elwood couple for more than half a century, was Catherine Miller. Historical records from Atchison, Kansas, paint a picture of a vibrant, beloved 23-year-old woman, known for her kindness and a gentle beauty that seemed to radiate an inner light. In mid-April of 1910, she boarded a train to visit relatives in St. Joseph and never arrived. Her disappearance prompted a frantic, widespread search. Authorities and volunteers dragged portions of the Missouri River and scoured the sun-baked countryside, their hopes dwindling with each passing day. Eventually, the search was abandoned, and the town of Atchison was left to mourn a loss made all the more painful for its stark lack of resolution. The only clue to her fate, a clue that lay dormant and unheeded in the archives of memory, came from Dr. James Harper, a young physician at the time. When interviewed decades later, the now elderly doctor vividly recalled the unsettling atmosphere at Catherine's memorial service. The church was filled with the sounds of authentic, heartbreaking grief. A community united in sorrow. Yet Dr. Harper's attention was inexorably drawn to two strangers standing near the back, a man and a woman who did not belong. Though well-dressed and possessing an air of educated refinement, they remained utterly detached from the collective sorrow, a pocket of cold stillness in the emotional storm. Their behavior, as Dr. Harper described it, was not that of mourners, but of appraisers. The tall, bearded man did not watch the minister's eulogy. He studied the ornate coffin at the front of the church with a dispassionate, almost carpenter-like eye, as if assessing its construction and materials. The woman, possessing a striking pale beauty, was even more disturbing. While others wept into their handkerchiefs, she was busy, making delicate sketches in a small, leather-bound notebook. Her focus was intense, her hand moving with a clinical precision. Harper, moving closer under the guise of finding a better seat, was shocked to see she was not sketching the grieving family, but the intricate floral arrangements that adorned the coffin, as if memorizing a tableau she wished to recreate. They showed no sadness, no empathy, only a quiet, focused, and utterly chilling interest. When Dr. Harper approached them after the service, they departed hurriedly, melting into the crowd without a word, leaving behind only an indelible impression of profound wrongness. This testimony, when finally cross-referenced with the dates in the Blackwood letters, provided the first piece of irrefutable evidence, linking the theoretical horror of their correspondence to the real-world tragedy of a life stolen. With the acquisition of Catherine Miller, their Atchison beauty, the gallery in Theodore's workshop was finally complete. She became, in their shared, distorted view, his finest work and the centerpiece of their world. Her preserved body was not a symbol of a crime to be hidden, but a trophy to be venerated, the ultimate testament to their artistic philosophy. Her beauty, once transient and subject to the ravages of time, was now, through their divine intervention, eternal. It was before this silent, captive witness that they decided to formalize their own union, a ceremony that would bind them together not just in life, but beyond the veil of death itself. The ceremony, which they referred to in their letters as their eternal binding, took place at the stroke of midnight on August 12th, 1910. The workshop was transformed into a profane cathedral. Dozens of candles were lit, their flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows that made the silent figures in the room seem to stir and breathe. The air was thick with a unique olfactory signature, the cloying sweetness of formaldehyde, the dusty scent of old velvet, and the acrid smoke of melting wax. Theodore and Eleanor wore long dark robes, suited more to a secret academic society or a religious order than a wedding. Standing before the raised platform where Catherine Miller lay in a state of enforced peace, they spoke their vows, their words, recorded with unholy reverence in Eleanor's letters, were not a promise of love and fidelity, but the articles of a macabre contract. "I accept this sacred responsibility," Eleanor vowed, her voice clear and steady in the candlelight, "to cherish and preserve your earthly vessel when your spirit has departed, to keep you from the cold indignity of the earth, until I may join you in stillness." Theodore echoed the sentiment, his voice resonating with a zealous, almost ecstatic fervor. They did not exchange rings, they exchanged relics. Theodore presented Eleanor with a set of antique, silver-handled embalming tools, their steel gleaming in the candlelight, while she gave him a locket containing a preserved human eye, its glass-like surface seeming to watch the proceedings from her open palm. This was their confession, a declaration of their shared faith to the silent, captive gods of their own making. It was in the euphoric aftermath of this ceremony that they solidified the final, most crucial article of their pact, drafting the letters that would serve as their will and testament for a shared eternity. "My beloved," Theodore wrote, "our loyal friend Jay will ensure we remain together, posed as we have illustrated in the drawings." This friend Jay, their only known accomplice, is believed to have been Jonathan Pruitt, a reclusive handyman and suspected grave robber from across the river, a man who moved through the world like a ghost, whose only loyalty was to coin, making him the perfect, unquestioning tool for their ultimate fantasy. For a few blissful months, the world of Theodore and Eleanor was a hermetically sealed paradise. But by autumn, the first hairline fractures began to appear in their sanctuary. The tone of their letters subtly shifts, the euphoric confidence replaced by a new, sharp note of anxiety. The outside world, which they had held in such contempt, was beginning to press in. The first pressure point was Dr. Morrison. He began to notice discrepancies in his inventory. Bottles of formaldehyde and carbolic acid were vanishing. He confronted Eleanor, his tone more confused than accusatory. Eleanor, a master of composure, met his gaze without flinching, offering a perfectly plausible explanation that temporarily placated him. But he was left with a lingering, cold spot of doubt that he could not logically explain but could not ignore. Her calm was too perfect. The second incursion came from the east. Theodore, working in his workshop, caught a flicker of movement in the adjacent field. It was James Henderson, the teenage farmer's son, creeping along the fence line, watching. Theodore felt a surge of cold, predatory rage. His sacred space was being violated by profane curiosity. "The boy's curiosity may prove problematic," he wrote to Eleanor, his handwriting tight with paranoia. "Should he glimpse our gallery, even accidentally, the consequences would be dire." From that night on, the workshop remained doubly locked, and Theodore's movements became even more furtive, the actions of a man who feels the constant weight of unseen eyes. The decisive blow came from the law. In early November, two stern-faced police officers from St. Joseph arrived in Elwood, investigating the disappearance of a 17-year-old boy named Samuel Potter, last seen heading towards the town. Their arrival at Theodore Blackwood's property was a profound shock to his insulated system. He met them on his porch, the picture of polite, articulate cooperation. He answered their questions flawlessly, but after they departed, a profound shift occurred. The house, once his fortress, now felt contaminated. The silence was no longer peaceful, but charged with the hum of imminent discovery. That night, he wrote the final, desperate letter in the collection. The elegant, philosophical prose was gone, replaced by clipped, urgent commands. "My dearest," he wrote, "we must accelerate our plans. Doctor, Morrison's questions have become too specific. The inquiry from St. Joseph cannot be ignored. I have made arrangements for our relocation. Pack only essentials and your most precious specimens. The rest must be hidden or destroyed. Meet me at midnight on Thursday at the appointed place. We shall cross into Nebraska and make our way west, where we can continue our work without interference." The fantasy was over. The walls were closing in. Their carefully constructed world, their beautiful, silent gallery, was about to be consumed by the fire of reality. The final letter was a death sentence for the world Theodore and Eleanor had built. Their carefully planned escape was not a distant contingency, but an imminent, desperate necessity. On the night of November 18th, 1910, 3 days after Theodore penned his urgent warning, the sky over Elwood, Kansas, ignited. A fire broke out at the Blackwood property. A conflagration of such unnatural intensity that it painted the clouds in hellish hues of orange and blue, visible for miles around. Neighbors, including a now deeply suspicious James Henderson, were the first to respond, but their efforts were futile. As Henderson later described in a statement to the sheriff, this was no ordinary house fire. The heat was so ferocious it drove them back 100 yards. The air thick with the smell, not just of burning wood, but of something else, something acrid, chemical, and sickeningly organic. A series of violent explosions erupted from the workshop, sending showers of fiery debris arcing into the night sky, suggesting the ignition of the vast quantities of chemicals stored within. It was a pagan pyre for their unholy creations, a final, violent act of purification and concealment. By dawn, nothing remained of the house and workshop but the stone foundation, a skeletal jaw exposed to the morning sky, and a column of greasy black smoke that stained the horizon. The official assumption was that the reclusive couple, Theodore Blackwood and the woman known as Eleanor Wright, had perished in the inferno they had likely started by accident. It was a neat, simple conclusion for a town eager to forget the unsettling presence that had lingered on its periphery. But Sheriff William Donovan's official report, filed 2 days later, contained a detail that starkly contradicted this comforting narrative. After a thorough sifting of the ashes and debris, the report states, no human remains of any kind have been identified. The fire, as intense as it was, could not have completely obliterated 2 adult bodies. This finding raised the chilling possibility that the blaze was not an accident, but a meticulously planned exit. The final, dramatic curtain drop on their performance in Elwood. The true horror of what that fire consumed was never made public, but it was seared into the minds of the few men who sifted through the ruins. Martha Wilson, the wife of one of those men, wrote a letter to her sister in December of 1910, a document that speaks to the trauma that lay buried beneath the official silence. Henry came home from that place in a state I have never seen. She wrote, he was white as a sheet, and he would not speak of what they found in that man's cellar. He would only say that it was unnatural, and that the sheriff had ordered everyone to keep silent. He has had nightmares ever since, calling out in his sleep about the faces and the glass eyes. The gallery was gone. Its contents turned to ash and memory, but its legacy had already begun to poison the dreams of the living. The collapse of their home was the successful redefinition of their existence. Theodore and Eleanor had vanished from the earth, leaving behind only scorched ground and a terrible, unspoken secret. The trail of Theodore and Eleanor went cold, vanishing as completely as their bodies from the ashes of their home. For decades, their story became a footnote, a half-forgotten piece of macabre local lore. History, it seemed, had swallowed them whole. It was not until 1963 that the past was violently exhumed, when a historian named Margaret Wells, researching rural correspondence, stumbled upon the metal box of letters that had miraculously survived the fire. For Wells, a tenacious and brilliant researcher, the letters were not just a historical curiosity, they were the prologue to an unsolved mystery. She became obsessed, dedicating the final years of her life to answering the question, what happened to the Blackwoods? Her investigation, detailed in a collection of private notes, is a masterclass in historical detective work. She followed the faintest of trails, tracking reports of similar unsolved disappearances and cases of medical malfeasance across the Midwest. Her search led her from Nebraska to Colorado, and finally to a small, fog-shrouded coastal town in Northern California. There, she discovered local records of a reclusive, educated couple who had arrived around 1911 and lived there until 1935 under the names Thomas and Elizabeth Bradford. The parallels were unmistakable. He claimed to be a retired medical researcher. She possessed a considerable knowledge of anatomy. They operated, according to local lore, a private museum of medical oddities that was open only to a few select, invited guests. The end of the Bradford story was as cryptic as their life. In 1935, following Elizabeth's death from an illness, Thomas Bradford was reported to have vanished, taking his wife's body with him before the authorities could be summoned. Wells's research culminated in early 1969 when she traveled to that same California town, convinced she was on the verge of uncovering the final chapter. Among her effects, after her death, was a sealed envelope addressed to the Donovan County Historical Society. It contained her compiled notes, along with a brief, chilling letter. "What I have found confirms my worst suspicions," she wrote. The Blackwoods did not perish in 1910, but continued their activities for decades. More disturbing still, I believe they may have had disciples who carry on their work. I have arranged to view the Bradford collection tomorrow. Should anything happen to me, please forward these materials to the proper authorities. Margaret Wells suffered a massive stroke the following day, just hours before her scheduled appointment. She died 3 weeks later without ever regaining consciousness. Her final, terrifying discovery died with her. Her story is a haunting legacy in itself, that of a woman who flew too close to the darkness and was consumed by it. But the echoes of the Blackwoods' activities did not end with her. In 1965, during a renovation in St. Joseph, Missouri, a hidden room was discovered containing preserved human remains, dated to the early 1900s, arranged in lifelike poses around a table. And in 2005, in that same small California town, demolition workers on an old, abandoned property, a property once owned by Thomas Bradford, uncovered a sealed basement room. Inside were 2 mummified bodies, locked in a final, eternal embrace. The state of preservation was so advanced, the chemical treatments so unusual, that forensic identification proved impossible. These lingering secrets, these terrible discoveries scattered across half a century, suggest that the story of the Blackwoods was not an isolated event, but perhaps a single chapter in a much larger, and still unfinished, book of horrors. What then are we to make of this story? It is a tale of desecration, of madness, of murder. But to dismiss it as such is to miss the most unsettling truth at its core. In her final notes, Margaret Wells wrote, "What troubles me most is not what they did, but that they found in each other the perfect companion for their darkness." In that sense, theirs is a love story, Perhaps the most terrifying kind. It is a testament to a chilling reality that no matter how deviant one's desires, how alien one's passions are to the rest of the world, there exists the possibility of finding another who shares them. And in that shared validation, the most monstrous of acts can be transformed into a sacred devotion. They constructed a philosophy that viewed death not as an ending, but as a transformation, a preservation of beauty beyond the corruption of life. In their distorted worldview, they were not desecrating the dead, they were elevating them to a state of permanent, artistic perfection. The truly frightening aspect of the Blackwoods is not what they did in the shadows of their workshop, but how completely normal they appeared in the sunlight of Elwood. They walked among their neighbors, attended church services, and conducted their business, all while harboring a secret world that would horrify those same people. It forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. How many others walk among us, wearing masks of normalcy that conceal unfathomable depths? The case of Theodore and Eleanor Blackwood stands as a disturbing reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural beings from myth or folklore, but ordinary people with extraordinary obsessions, who find in each other the permission to let their darkest impulses take flight. Margaret Wells's last written words, penned the day before her fatal stroke, remain the story's final, cryptic epitaph. I believe I have found them at last, or what remains of them. God help me, I think they achieved their final wish. What did she mean, what final? Terrible tableau did she believe she was about to witness? Did they succeed in their pact, preserved together for eternity by their mysterious accomplice? Or is their legacy something more insidious, the knowledge they passed on? A network of like-minded individuals, a darkness that continues to echo in the quiet corners of the world. Perhaps it's better that some mysteries remain unsolved, some doors unopened. The case of the Necrophiliac couple of 1910 reminds us that history's darkest corners often remain unexplored, not because they cannot be illuminated, but because what might be revealed there challenges our fundamental understanding of love, of devotion, and of human nature itself.